Happy Memorial Day to you who are in the U.S. This is a national holiday where we remember those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in our military for our nation. And it's for those of you in Kenya, it's sort of like Mashujaa Day, Heroes Day. I think that's October 20th. It's similar to that. Those who went before you fighting for independence for the nation of Kenya. So similar, very similar. So today people are having picnics and they're working outside and they're hopefully reflecting on the great and ultimate sacrifice that men and women made for our country here in the United States. For Monday Moments today, we're going to talk about poetry. Now, this genre is one that we won't have too much trouble as far as understanding that we don't take it literally, and because most countries have some form of poetic books. But the thing about it is we know what elements are in poetry. We might not know the vocabulary that goes with those elements. And we're going to review some of those that we've talked about before. And I'll probably introduce you to a few that you've not heard before. As far as poetry in the Old Testament, it's in almost every book of the Old Testament. And that means it takes up about a third of the Bible. Poetry takes up about a third of the Bible. In poetry, it appeals to people's emotions, right? When we think of poetry, we think of love, or we think of what was the word I was thinking of? Like drama or just disaster, And so it appeals to people's emotions, and the emotions convey the meaning of what the writer is trying to get the reader to understand. So images is one way that the poet makes that different than other genres, makes poetry different than other genres, especially I think of the New Testament letters. They are nothing like poetry. They have a sequence, right? They have the introduction, they have the greetings, they have the body of the letter, they have a doxology, some of them. They have a formula. Well, poetry has similar structures, but they're not all poems have that, and not all are, they're conveying meaning rather than Paul doesn't need to have imagery he uses it sometimes, but he doesn't need to have imagery to convey what he wants to be conveyed to the churches that he's planted in the New Testament. He is clear. He can just state the facts. So we do not interpret poetry like we interpret the other books, other genres in the Bible, especially the New Testament letters. So as far as poetic books, here are the poetic books in the Bible. Again, almost every book in the Old Testament has some poetry in it, but books that are labeled in the genre of poetry are Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Lamentations. Okay, so those are the poetic books. So in order to interpret the poetic books correctly, to interpret them rightly, a reader must be familiar with the elements that are common to poetry. And the first element is terseness. Terseness, that's a silly word, isn't it? Terseness just means you're using the minimum, sorry about that, everyone, using the minimum number of words. For example, show me your ways, Lord, teach me your paths. That's terseness, using a minimum number of words. The next element is structure. Text is structured around poetic lines of verse rather than sentences and paragraphs. So there's two that we're going to talk about, two structures: parallelism, one thought expressed in two lines, and then acrostics, Each successive line starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This is something you might have done in elementary school. You might have written a poem using the ABCs. Like each line started with a different letter, or it could have been your name. A lot of times we did things like that. You'd write your name, and then each line would begin with. So for me, Deidre, I'd have two D's. Lines with D, two lines with E, one with an R, and one with an A. That's acrostics. But parallelism is what we're going to talk about first. And that is when, a single thought in two lines of text. For our purpose, we're going to talk about these types of parallelism: synonymous, developmental, illustrative, contrastive, and formal. Synonymous. You know what a synonym is? Two things that are alike, right? So let's look at an example of synonymous. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. So you see how those are the same. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. Synonymous parallelism. There's also developmental parallelism, and this is when the first line is developed in more thoroughly in the second line. So we call the first line A. A is an idea, and B develops that idea. And I gave you an example there of Psalm 119:9. Let's see. Illustrative. Illustrative is kind of like developmental, except for you have an idea. A conveys the idea, and then B gives an example or an image of that idea. So let's take a look at that. Sovereign Lord, my strong deliverer, there's our idea. You shield my head in the day of battle. There's our image to convey that God is our strong deliverer. We also have contrastive, which you understand what contrast means. So it's going to be two opposite, right? Two opposite ideas. And then we have formal, and this is kind of a catch-all for anything that isn't contrastive or illustrative or developmental or synonymous. So those are different forms of parallelism that we find in Old Testament poetry. As I mentioned earlier, and the other part is acrostics. Acrostic, using each letter. Sometimes in poetry, they use the first letter of each verse. Okay, so first letter of each verse will be a different letter. Sometimes they use the first letter of each line. So, say in parallelism, you have, show me your ways, O Lord, teach me your paths. The first line the first letter would be show me, the S, right? You have to pretend that we're talking about Hebrew. We're saying it in English, but we're talking about the Hebrew alphabet. Or the first letter of each line. So we could, if we were using show me your ways, O Lord, that would be a letter. And then teach me your paths, that would be the second letter, which is great because S is followed by T. But again, we're talking about the Hebrew alphabet, which really makes sense when we're talking about other examples like Lamentations 1-4 or Proverbs 31 or the longest poetic books, the longest Psalm 119. What it does is it uses a different Hebrew letter for each of the 8 verses. So like verse 1-8 begins with Aleph and then A. And then verses 9-16 begin with Beth, B. And that's how it sections it off. And that's what an acrostic is, another structure that poets would use to convey the meaning and convey the emotion of what they wanted the biblical reader to understand. Next, we have figurative imagery. So there's 2 types of figurative imagery. The first one is figures of speech using analogy. Now, these are going to be some words that you might say, oh, I think I've heard of that before, because we've used these in other genres. For example, simile. Simile is a comparison using like or as. We talked about that at the very beginning of the study. So let's look at an example of that. Like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. When I do purity shows, that this is one of the verses that I use. As the deer pants for the streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. So you see, like and as, a comparison and an analogy using like or as. Now, metaphor is like a simile, but it's an analogy, but it doesn't use like or as. It's without like or as. Like here's an example. The Lord is my shepherd. You get the analogy. The Lord is the shepherd, but there isn't a like or as connecting it. An indirect analogy. Let me think about that one for a minute. Indirect. Okay, that's using analogy, but you don't directly state the comparison. Like Lord and shepherd was stated. But in an indirect analogy, you kind of have to, it's there. You're able to see what the author is intending, but he doesn't state it directly. His faithfulness, Psalm 91, his faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. So when you see it in the rest of, in its context, his faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. It's an indirect analogy. God's faithfulness is my protection. It's my shield and it is my rampart. It will cover me. It will protect me. And then hyperbole. Do you remember that one? We had that before. Hyperbole is an exaggeration. It's an exaggeration so that the reader or the listener, especially in the context of the Old Testament, would, because it was an oral tradition, right? They would understand what the effect that the biblical writer was trying to give. Let's look at these. My tears have been my food day and night. Now we know literally his tears have not been his food, but David is saying, my tears, that's all I've been able to do. I've consumed those day and night. It's very dramatic, right? Exaggeration. How about this one? I beat them as fine as windblown dust. I trampled them like mud in the streets. You can see in that there's actually, both of those lines are similes. I beat them as fine as windblown dust. I trampled them like mud in the streets. But it also is hyperbole because it is an exaggeration. He didn't really beat them as fine as windblown dust. He might have felt like it, but he didn't. And he didn't really trample them like mud in the streets. So that's hyperbole. Now we have figurative imagery, figures of speech, using substitution. These words might not be as familiar to you. I don't think we've really gone over any of these except for maybe irony. And most of you know what that is already because we say, oh, hi, you're in a conversation and somebody says something and you say, oh, how ironic, right? You understand what irony is. So for this, the first one is metonym. A metonym is a cause and effect. The biblical writer states something, and it is either the effect or the cause in response to something else that they assume we know what is happening or what has happened. Synecdoche, sorry, my voice is, I'm losing it here. Synecdoche is when a part represents a whole. And I gave you some verses so you can take a look at that on your own. But let's take a look at a metonym. Speak this word to them. Let my eyes overflow with tears, night and day without ceasing. For the virgin daughter, my people, has suffered a grievous wound, a crushing blow. This is Jeremiah 14. So what Jeremiah is saying is this is the effect and what was the cause. Do you remember what happened in Jeremiah's day? That is when the Babylonian captivity had happened. That's when they're taken captive and Jeremiah's taken off to Egypt, carted off to Egypt. And this is the effect of that. This is the metonym is the effect of the cause of Jerusalem being destroyed. So then we have apostrophe. Apostrophe is when you address someone that's not actually present. So you're talking as if the person is there, but they're not actually there. Irony, you know what that is? Irony is when you're saying something, but you mean something completely different. And then word plays. Word plays don't they get lost in translation when it comes to poetry in the Bible, because the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, right? So if we understood Hebrew, we would understand the wordplay. But when we read it, it's in English, so the wordplay is completely lost on us. Let's look at an example of irony. Tell us, you idols, what is going to happen. Tell us what the former things were, so that we may consider them and know their final outcome. Or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds, so we may know that you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear. Now, this is the prophet Isaiah, and he's writing this, and he's talking to the idols, and he's saying, you know, we want to know what you're going to do, and so we can respond to that. And that's not really what he's doing. It's ironic because he doesn't care. He knows that God has more power than the idols, and he knows what their final outcome is and what their future holds. They aren't determining what Israel's future holds. So that's why it is irony. So when we are interpreting poetry, we need to use the tools that we just learned and put in our toolbox. We identify the parallelism, right? Which kind of parallelism? We locate and visualize the figures of speech, and then we enter into the emotional world of the image. If we do this, it will prevent us from misinterpreting or adding an interpretation that is completely not what the poetic biblical writer was intending. Many times it's what you read is what the emotional response is. However you feel that's what the biblical author was trying to get you to understand and feel. Just like in poetry that we have in modern day poetry, or what we read when we're in elementary school or high school when we have to read Emily Dickinson. So I want to make a special point about the Psalms. The Psalms are unique. As a result, interpreting the Psalms involves extra special attention. First, we must remember that the Psalms were not written to be doctrine. They weren't written to be doctrine, or they weren't written to be examples of moral behavior. And a lot of times that's how people interpret them as. The Psalms are really songs, right? And they are inspired models of how to talk to God and to sing to God, how to pray to God and how to praise God. That's what the Psalms were intended to be, not doctrine and not examples of moral behavior. So when you are reading the Psalms, take in the expression of the deep emotion that the psalmist is conveying by the parallelism and the figures of speech that he is using. The psalm is a conversation with God, and usually the conversation has these three basic contexts. There's more, but these are the basic contexts. If you had to narrow it down, the basic contexts of the Psalms are either their seasons of well-being, their seasons of anguish, right? We know that. Psalm 51, create in me a clean heart, O God. Take not thy Holy Spirit from me, right? So then we see on their seasons of surprise. David gets surprised and he rejoices and delights in the Lord. And seasons of well-being, I'm trying to think of a good one for that. So many. Where's a good one? Why so downcast, O my soul? Put your trust in God. So there's different psalms in context, and because David was on the run, he was on the lam for 15 years running from Saul. And during that time, a lot of these psalms were written. So he had, and then in other parts of his life, or even parts of his life, like Psalm 51 with Bathsheba. So there are different circumstances surrounding the Psalms. And if you read First Kings and Second Kings, or First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, or even First Samuel and Second Samuel, and you compare it to where that psalm is, then you will be able to, I think we talked about that before with the narratives, the Old Testament narratives. Then you'll be able to see, oh, this is what was going on right then. This is what Israel was experiencing right then. That's why this psalm is as it is. It's a psalm of anguish. It's a psalm of surprise. It's a psalm of well-being or delight. Okay, well, that was poetry for us, poetic books in the Old Testament. Next week, we are going to have our final session on getting a grip in the Bible, and we're going to talk about wisdom literature. That's a good thing to end on, right? Wisdom. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you next week.